Last time, we witnessed Pienaar's epic defiance as the 2nd New Zealand Division came under heavy pressure from all sides. This time, 2nd New Zealand Division is attacked again, and things are looking bad for them and the British overall. Can the remains of Freyberg's division hold on? Will the British armour intervene? Can Rommel deliver the killing blow? And is Pienaar going to continue to avoid the battle? Let's find out. Notes and sources are in the pinned comment. Timestamps to various parts of the video are in the description. By dawn on the 1st of December 1941, Pienaar's brigade was still 1.6 kilometres, a mile, short of point 175, which shouldn't be much of a surprise at this point. Early in the morning, Godwin-Austen sent a signal to Ritchie asking about future policy. He said that if the attempt to retake point 175 failed, and if the British armour could not prevent the constant attacks by the enemy's armour, he may have to consider withdrawing 13th Corps into Tobruk. And this wasn't Godwin-Austen giving in. He was being practical. The situation for 13th Corps, and the New Zealanders especially, was desperate, and something needed to be done. On the German side, Butcher messaged Kruvel complaining of harassing fire from his flank and rear, and requested permission to fall back to the Panzer Corps HQ at Burbu-Kremeza. Kruvel angrily dismissed Butcher's request. Why? Because he knew that Butcher had also sent this request to Rommel first, which was over Kruvel's head. And Kruvel wasn't particularly happy with this action. It seems that both Rommel and now his subordinates weren't taking him seriously. And remember, this is the guy who had commanded 11th Panzer Division in what was arguably the biggest tank battle of the war, so it's not like Kruvel wasn't capable of commanding. German forces were exhausted at this point. However, 15th Panzer Division did seem to have some fighting willpower left, so Rommel decided to use them to drag the New Zealand Division away from the Tobruk perimeter. At 0400 hours on the 1st of December, they moved east and then attacked the summit of Belhamid from the east and southeast. Despite getting hit by their own artillery, thanks Mikkel, they grappled with Kippenberger's 20th Battalion. The 25-pounders of 6th New Zealand Field Regiment reported that they knocked out a dozen panzers, but they lost twice that many guns in return. British Matildas and Valentines on their western flank could not see through the smoke, and therefore were unable to assist in the ferocious close combat fighting going on. The pressure of the panzers and motorised infantry was too much. New Zealand anti-tank guns were rapidly knocked out, and the 300 or so remaining men of Kippenberger's 20th Battalion were overrun. They chose to surrender rather than be annihilated. Freyberg's division was now cut in two. Some of the panzers moved towards 18th Battalion, and having witnessed the destruction of 20th Battalion, some of the New Zealanders started to surrender prematurely. It was a moment for prompt action, and prompt action there was. All the officers within earshot roared at those offering to surrender, and not only the officers, for one man reports that their mates stopped them. Taking no chances in the face of an entire panzer division, Peart decided to withdraw his battalion. Under fire, they moved northwest over the escarpment, and then Peart rallied his battalion and moved it back onto the escarpment to form a defensive line. Luckily, the Germans were too busy looting 20th Battalion's positions to pursue 18th Battalion, and so they were spared the worst of it. It's worth noting that half of 19th Battalion was with 18th Battalion at this time, and the other half of 19th Battalion was at Zafran. The 1st of December was also Major Burton's birthday, which he and his battalion celebrated in their positions near the blockhouse at Sidi Rezegh. The good news for them was that, at dawn on the 1st of December, Gatehouse had moved his armour up to the edge of the airfield. The armour were fired upon from the west, thanks to Mikkel, and from the east, thanks to the Arete, and they lost several of their M3 light tanks. But Barraclough's men were happy that the British tanks had arrived, At about 0900 hours, 4th Armoured Brigade's 2 leading battalions, 5th Battalion Royal Tank Regiment and the 8th Hussars, parked themselves on the exposed positions north of Sidi Rezegh at the rear of 25th Battalion. They were also greeted by the remains of 24th and 26th Battalions, which was about 80 riflemen, cooks and clerks. By this point, the Panzers had turned south to attack the remains of 6th New Zealand Brigade, quickly gaining the upper hand. Lieutenant Colonel Drew, commanding 5th Battalion Royal Tank Regiment, now reported to Brigadier Barraclough. After a situation report, the two began to make a plan. At this point, 4th Armoured Brigade did have more tanks than 15th Panzer Division, which had around 40 Panzers, so the argument has been made that together they could have engaged and possibly savaged the Panzer Division at this point. The problem is, there's a sharp contradiction in the historiography. In other words, the sources aren't clear, and historians can't agree on what actually happened. Gott's biographer, Nash, says that it was Gatehouse's interpretation of Gott's orders that led him to order a withdrawal of both 6th New Zealand Brigade and 4th Armoured Brigade. So basically, Gatehouse made the decision, and it's Gatehouse's fault. The problem is that the official British history clearly states that while the orders for the withdrawal did come from Gatehouse's brigade, Gatehouse was acting on orders from Gott. And that makes sense, since orders get passed down the chain of command. It also seems unlikely that Gatehouse, as a brigade commander, could have ordered Barraclough, another brigade commander, to withdraw. Also, taking into account that Nash is trying to make the case that Gott was a great general and comes to his defence constantly, his account of the events is probably biased in favour of Gott. But it could also be right. So, without knowing which version is correct, I'm just going to favour the official British history here, just because it makes more sense for a higher commander to issue orders to a lower commander. Therefore, shortly after Drew and Barraclough began to plan, a message was received over the radio telephone from Headquarters 4th Armoured Brigade, transmitting an order from General Gott ordering the New Zealanders to retire. Gatehouse and Drew thought they'd all withdraw southwards, and therefore made preparations to support this, but the New Zealanders actually withdrew towards Zafran, where the rest of 2nd New Zealand Division were concentrating. At 10 AM, Burton was ordered to move to Bir Scuerat, which he did promptly with the remains of 6th Brigade under heavy fire from all directions. 4th Armoured Brigade remained where it was, just in case 15th Panzer Division decided to attack Barraclough's men as they withdrew. Then, Gatehouse's brigade fell back south, up to the escarpment. Both of these moves were watched by the Ariete and the 21st Panzer Division, neither of which felt compelled to intervene, but this is understandable since the Germans, and indeed the British as well, were completely exhausted. By now, exhaustion was affecting almost everyone in the battle area, and one of the New Zealander historians who had been taken prisoner and was in the hospital wadi, now in the hands of the Ariete, noted that German troops in the neighbourhood were walking like zombies. The dash to the wire had not only reduced 21st Panzer to less than half its strength in men and less than a third in equipment, it had also worn what remained down almost to the limits of physical endurance, and General Butcher does not seem to have been the man to rejuvenate them. But while the men were exhausted, the new British commander definitely was not. Ritchie flew to 13th Corps HQ to explain his ideas for the future offensive he was planning to make. Undeterred by the awful situation 2nd New Zealand Division were in, and the fact that Pienaar was being difficult, to say the least, Godwin Austen confidently informed Ritchie that 13th Corps could not only hold the Tobruk salient, but also attack. Ritchie then became anxious to attack as soon as possible. He did, however, leave the timing of the attack to Norrie, who had to arrange it, and he didn't want to launch it prematurely. Norrie proposed the 3rd of December as the start of the attack, and then would delay it because he needed a few more days to prepare. It was now that Auchinleck arrived at 8th Army headquarters to give a hand. He would remain by Ritchie's side for the next 10 days. There's also another debate that says Auchinleck either left Ritchie to conduct the operation alone, and Auchinleck just focused on bringing up reinforcements, or in fact Auchinleck commanded British forces with Ritchie as his deputy. To be honest, it's probably a combination of the two. Auchinleck did concentrate on bringing up reinforcements, pulling units from all over the place, but he didn't need to be at 8th Army's HQ to do this. So, there's no doubt that he was there to give Ritchie advice. Ritchie was, after all, taking over where Cunningham left off, picking up the pieces of somebody else's battle. Either way, with Auchinleck's on-hand support, the British command crisis was finally over and they could get on with the battle. Speaking of reinforcements, in addition to the 2nd South African Division, which now had the remains of 5th New Zealand Brigade attached, 1st Armoured Division had disembarked in Egypt in the second half of November. Its 12th Lancers armoured cars and the divisional artillery were ordered to join 8th Army as soon as possible. Meanwhile, 2nd Armoured Brigade with 60 M3 lights and 106 Crusader tanks were busy training for desert warfare and would hopefully join the battle later. A bunch of other new units were moved to Bagush as a reserve force, including the armoured cars of the Royal Dragoons, pulled from Syria, the 105th Infantry Brigade, nabbed from Cyprus, the 50th Divisional Reconnaissance Battalion, borrowed from Palestine, and the newly formed 38th Indian Infantry Brigade was brought up from Egypt. Rommel did not have any reinforcements at all, so clearly the British would have the material advantage if they could just hold course and not get beaten. And these reinforcements could actually allow the withdrawal and refitting of other units already engaged, including Freyberg's men. By 1400 hours, Freyberg knew that this was the only option left for his division. By this point, Freyberg had lost confidence with the British tank force and with Pienaar. He made it quite clear to both 13th Corps and 30th Corps that he felt abandoned by both the British and the South Africans. Angrily, he stated that he was going to withdraw to Norrie, who it seems had little choice but to agree with Freyberg's proposal. Freyberg didn't even bother to mask his own words over the radio, which clearly shows his frustration at this point. When Ritchie heard later what had happened, he wasn't happy with Norrie for approving the withdrawal, but it was too late to do anything but accept the decision that had already been made. But it looks like Norrie may not have stopped Freyberg, even if he had wanted to. This is up for debate, but given the fact that the promised reinforcements had failed to arrive, it's completely understandable why Freyberg was insisting that he withdraw. Pienaar was insubordinate, and there are several examples of insubordination throughout the rest of the North African campaign, which are probably the fault of those insubordinate commanders. However, in this instance, given the circumstances, Freyberg is probably justified. His division is battered, and there's little indication that the promised reinforcements will arrive in time or indeed save the situation. Withdrawal does seem like the only option, and historians seem to agree on this point. In fact, Godwin Austen wasn't even sure if 70th Division was strong enough now to hold onto El Duda or not. But a message came from Lieutenant Colonel Nichols of 1st Essex Battalion, still commanding the force at El Duda. Nichols said that he felt confident he could hold on against any attack, so Godwin Austen decided to hold on. Meanwhile, at the frontier, 7th Indian Infantry Brigade cleared Libyan Omar of Axis troops. The Indians also relieved 5th New Zealand Infantry Brigade, minus the HQ because that had been captured, in the Capuzzo, Merced and Sollum areas. This allowed them to move northwest to the Menester area to keep pressure on Bardia. In addition, 2nd South African Division was moving forward to take over the frontier area from the 4th Indian Division, which would then free up the Indians to move west. 5th Indian Brigade moved to the Sidi Aziz area. Meanwhile, Freyberg and the remains of his division in the area, plus the 10 remaining tanks of 1st Army Tank Brigade, fell back to the area around Zafran. Some elements of Inglis's 4th New Zealand Infantry Brigade withdrew into the Tobruk perimeter, but most went west with the rest of the division. They successfully disengaged from the Germans and overnight drove their way further east, then south across the Tre Capuzzo. Passing Bir el Gubi by dawn, they crossed the wire and headed for Bagush. On the way, a small group of Italians surrendered to them, but because of a lack of transport, they were let loose so they could go back to their unit. Strangely enough, these Italians found an abandoned truck, got it working, and followed the New Zealanders. It seems that they too had had enough of the fighting as well. At this point, Tobruk was once again closed in a siege. Rommel had cleared the ground southeast of Tobruk, except for El Duda, but this had been at great cost in men and equipment. There was no chance of fresh reinforcements and the men were exhausted. So attrition was slowly eating away at his forces. Rommel had given instructions that the Afrika Korps was to destroy the remains of the New Zealand Division, and Kruvel had ordered 21st Panzer Division to stay where it was, blocking the Tre Capuzzo. But despite both of these orders, Butcher decided that the enemy withdrawal ahead of him gave him the opportunity to press on west, which he did. By evening, the 5th Panzer Regiment had moved 5 miles along the Tre Capuzzo, climbed the escarpment on the west side of the landing ground, and had dug in around the Sidi Rezegh Mosque. The rest of the division and support vehicles were following. Apart from 5th New Zealand Brigade, which would continue the fight, Freyberg's division was withdrawn. It was a sad end to the New Zealanders, who had fought exceptionally hard against 3 Axis armoured divisions plus other infantry divisions. They had done more than their fair share of the fighting, but for them, Operation Crusader was over. With the New Zealanders gone, 4th Armoured Brigade also withdrew back to their original night position and then fell back even further, spending the next night at Berbereneb. Pienaar's 1st South African Brigade also withdrew back to Tebel Essem. Bad weather grounded most aircraft on the 2nd of December, and Rommel intercepted British signals and now knew that the British wouldn't attack before the 3rd. But he was anxious about the isolated frontier garrisons and decided to use this lull to try and give some support to them. Yes, another dash to the wire. Kruvel was obviously against this, pointing out that the tanks were immobilised and desperately needed repairs and maintenance. Kruvel clearly didn't want a repeat of Rommel's last eastward adventure, which, if it failed as much as the last one, would probably result in the destruction of the rest of the panzers. Overruling Kruvel's protests, Rommel ordered a reconnaissance effort along the coast road and the Tre Capuzzo to test out enemy strengths. He believed that if a camp group from both panzer divisions was created and sent off immediately, they could salvage the situation. Each of these camp grouping was to consist of roughly an infantry battalion, an anti-tank company and some guns, and be protected on the southern flank by the Italian 20th Corps, which would also move along the Tre Capuzzo. At least, that was the plan. Rommel's staff, however, were appalled by this proposal. His supply staff were telling him that stocks of everything were running low, so this adventure was probably not wise. Rommel dismissed his supply staff's concerns, but he did actually message Mussolini on the 2nd of December saying that supplies were desperately needed if they were to have a chance of victory. And after Rommel's message 2 days earlier, Mussolini had spoken with Hitler about the supply situation, telling him that just 40,000 of the required 120,000 tons of supplies had been shipped to North Africa in November, and that things were actually getting worse. Due to British naval interdiction, only warships were getting through, and these only had a small cargo capacity. Mussolini told Rommel this as well, but Rommel couldn't accept it. Clearly the Italians were just making excuses. Whatever the reason, time was now against him and Rommel had to act fast or lose the attritional fight that favoured the British. The 3rd of December was a lull in the fighting, with only the reconnaissance forces probing east to see what the opposition was. The weather remained bad, slowing the reconnaissance camp grouping down, but not bad enough because the RAF spotted both of them. This probably explains why the 5th New Zealand Brigade and Love's 28th Maori Battalion were able to ambush the northern camp group 10 miles west of Bardia and almost wipe it out completely. The southern camp group also didn't have much luck driving into a force from 4th Indian Division. The Indians pelted it with very heavy artillery bombardments, then called in effective air support. This persuaded the battered camp group to sulk off back where it came from. Rommel wouldn't learn about these actions until the next day, and despite these setbacks, the German camp group wanted to try again tomorrow as well. And Rommel wanted to retake El Duda, which was blocking the Tobruk bypass road. The one benefit that Rommel's 2 camp grouping had was that they persuaded Ritchie that Rommel's main effort was going to be made to the east. Ritchie therefore ordered 4th Armoured Brigade to be ready to intervene and hopefully stop Rommel's advances. Ritchie's plan to advance through Bir el Gubi and take El Adam was delayed, but almost ready. 1st South African Brigade was to move to protect the field maintenance centres, which freed up the more proactive 22nd Guards Infantry Brigade to assist in this advance. Both Anderson's 11th Indian Brigade and Marriott's 22nd Guards Brigade were ordered towards El Gubi, and if they cleared the area, the 136 M3 light tanks of Gatehouse's 4th Armoured Brigade would be free to attack El Adam. Meanwhile, 7th Support Group would maintain pressure on the Axis forces in the north. At this point, British reconnaissance discovered an Italian position 6 miles northwest of Bir el Gubi. This was the Young Fascist Battalion on Point 182. Norrie decided that Point 182 must be captured before the advance on El Adam could begin. Therefore, Gott ordered Anderson's 11th Indian Infantry Brigade, which was 30 miles east of Bir el Gubi at this point, to take the position. Anderson only had time to make a quick and simple plan to take the position, but it was a bold one, which would go in the next day. Anderson's force successfully marched 20 miles overnight and, repeating the tactics used at the Nabuia and Tomars camps during Operation Compass, attacked from the west of the Italian positions. The 2nd Battalion of the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders assaulted the Young Fascist Battalion on Point 182 and, after a fierce fight which lasted all day, they took part of the objective. In addition, a squadron from the King's Dragoon Guards also found the largest supply dump the Italians had 20 miles northwest of Bir el Gubi, and the Indian troops also destroyed another supply dump 6 miles northwest of Bir el Gubi. Rommel was now seriously concerned about his supply situation. The Germans had captured British transports, which eased the transport of supplies on land, but their fuel stocks were now running low, not helped by the loss of the 2 Italian supply dumps. Rommel was now given full awareness of the state of his formations and told exactly what his losses had been over the past couple of weeks. In addition to the loss of 16 officers, including von Ravenstein, they had lost 3,800 men, 142 panzers, 25 armoured cars, 390 trucks, and a great deal of other equipment. At this point, Rommel now received news that Bir el Gubi was being attacked by a brigade group with artillery and over 100 tanks. This seemed good at first because it meant 4th Indian Division had moved away from the frontier, which might give Rommel a chance to free his frontier forces. But then came news that Ely's 15th Motorcycle Battalion had been destroyed on its eastern reconnaissance mission. Worse, German attacks against El Duda by 21st Panzer Division Group Mikkel and the 200th Engineer Battalion were halted by heavy artillery fire. As 155th Artillery Regiment supported their troops, a jog column appeared around Bir Bu Kremisa, stunned them with an artillery barrage, and caused the Germans to cease fire. On top of this, the jog column then struck the Pavia Division, took a load of prisoners and captured their anti-tank guns. The German attack on El Duda therefore fell apart, and they were repulsed. Rome now responded to Rommel's request for more reinforcements. Colonel Montezemolo, head of the operations branch of Comando Supremo, arrived. Now, it's not clear in the sources if Montezemolo arrived on the 4th or the 5th of December, but either way, Montezemolo told Rommel that 22 ships had set off to North Africa, but 14 of them had been sunk for a loss of 62% of their cargo. 60,000 tons of supplies Rommel badly needed were now lying at the bottom of the Mediterranean. Montezemolo also told Rommel that the British naval and air efforts would prevent anything getting through, and the supply situation probably wouldn't be cleared up until late December. Not only would Rommel not get any replacements, but the fuel situation was so desperate that there may not even be enough to retreat. Rommel told Montezemolo that he was going to have to withdraw from Cyrenaica. He promised to do what he could to get most of the immobile Italian infantry back to safety, but admitted that most of their heavy equipment would have to be abandoned. And there was little he could do for the frontier garrisons, who would have to be withdrawn by sea or air. Clearly, the situation was becoming desperate for the Axis. At noon, Rommel accepted the inevitable. He called off the attack on El Duda and withdrew the columns heading for Bardia and Sidi. He needed to concentrate his forces on the southern flank to counter the British armour, so ordered 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions and the Ariete Division and the Trieste Division to move to the southern flank. Because his forces around Tobruk were quite thin, it was no longer practical to maintain the siege lines. He therefore ordered the Africa Division and the Bologna Division to begin moving to the south, and they began to withdraw during the night. Yes, Rommel was stripping the eastern end of the Tobruk perimeter of its besieging forces. Further orders went out to the Africa Corps. They were to concentrate west of El Adam, along with the Italians. By evening on the 4th of December, the Ariete and 15th Panzer Division drove back along the Tre Capuzzo to El Adam under fire from the Jock columns. 4th Armoured Brigade was also moving to the northeast, screened by more armoured cars of the Jock columns. Ritchie, though, was still concerned about Rommel's second dash to the wire. But when he spoke to Norrie said it would probably be better for 4th Armoured Brigade to go back to its earlier positions at Bir Bereneb, rather than overreact to Rommel's moves. On Norrie's advice, Ritchie ordered 4th Armoured Brigade back to Bir Bereneb, which it did on the night of 4th to 5th of December. This just left 2 infantry brigades around Bir el Gubi against the entire Africa Corps. On the 5th, Anderson's attack resumed, but this time was repulsed. Rommel hoped to deal with the British infantry, then sweep on into the rear area of 30 Corps. But the panzers didn't get moving until late afternoon. The Ariete Division was interdicted by the 7th Support Group and never arrived, and the Trieste Division didn't even leave its positions on the southern escarpment. 8th Panzer Regiment and elements of 115th Schutzen Regiment did reach the battlefield and smashed 2nd Battalion of the 5th Maratha Infantry on point 182. Knocking out their anti-tank guns, A and C companies collapsed, and other companies fell back to the 2nd Battalion of the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders, and point 182 was taken by the Germans. But soon after this action, the German forces at point 182 lost their will to continue. The Germans began withdrawing westwards in the evening, and even then this wasn't an efficient retreat. German units became mixed up and they trickled back in confusion. It was clear that exhaustion had gripped the German forces, which gave the fresher British forces the advantage. Rommel was now worried about the state that his forces were in. Norrie hoped to advance towards El Adam the next day with the whole of 4th Indian Division. So he ordered 22nd Guards Brigade to relieve the 11th Indian Infantry Brigade west of Bir el Gubi early on the 6th, which would free up Anderson for the advance. But at dawn on the 6th, Norrie changed his mind. He now thought that, with the Afrika Korps parked nearby, 4th Indian Division should be used to defend the Bir el Gubi area, as well as 22nd Guards Brigade. He also thought it should probe around the area, since nobody really knew where the enemy was. 8th Army's intelligence staff thought that Axis forces were about to withdraw, but Ritchie didn't believe them. Instead, he urged Norrie to avoid getting embroiled at Bir el Gubi and instead advance to the northwest. But it seems that the disorganisation on both sides prevented this from becoming a reality. At this point, both sides were interlocked, and it was difficult for the men on the ground to be sure which formations were friendly and which were not. The dust, the dirt, and the fact that both sides employed each other's vehicles meant that nobody really knew where exactly the front lines were. And the Afrika Korps was alone. The Italians still hadn't arrived, and in fact reported that their troops were exhausted and were no longer fit for action. Crüwell knew he needed the Italians' help if he was going to defeat the British, so throughout this time he repeatedly radioed, "Where is GAMBARA? Where is GAMBARA?" But GAMBARA was nowhere to be found. This then became a common joke amongst the German troops in Africa, who saw the Italians as inferiors to themselves. And the thing is, while the Italian troops certainly hadn't performed flawlessly, they weren't to blame for the situation the Axis in North Africa now found themselves in. The reality was, it was the Germans who were at fault. Crüwell's poor tactics and Rommel's dash to the wire were the reason they were now losing this battle. Rommel hadn't destroyed the British armour when he had the chance, and had left the battlefield, allowing the British to repair and reorganise. Meanwhile, the German and Italian troops had driven around in a big circle, getting fatigued for no reason. The Italians had done a lot of damage to the British earlier in the battle. They'd also held off the British on several occasions in effective defensive actions. Granted, the Arete division hadn't been super speedy in its advance, but I would argue this was due more to German haste than to Italian slowness. And the Trieste division had done almost nothing, and I don't know why, but Rommel had pushed his forces as rapidly as possible to the wire, far quicker than they should have moved, which resulted in acute disorganisation and huge logistical, attritional and maintenance problems. And this was the second time he'd done this, the first being in his first desert offensive. While there was some benefits to doing this, there was obviously downsides as well, and it seems that the Italians weren't willing to sacrifice their cohesion for raw speed. What we have to remember as well is that the Germans were National Socialists. Yes, there weren't atrocities in North Africa, but the German soldiers and officers believed themselves to be a superior race, and they often couldn't accept the fact that they'd messed up. It's always someone else's fault. It's the Romanians' fault, it was the weather's fault, it was that madman Hitler's fault, and finally it was the Italians' fault as well. Unfortunately, none of this is true, and the Italians were not at fault for the situation Rommel, Crüwell and their forces now found themselves in at this juncture. The fault clearly falls on the German leadership, especially Rommel. What's also interesting is that the pro-Italian sources that I have don't mention the "Where is GAMBARA" incident. You'd think that these authors, who were quick to defend or promote the actions of Italian units in the war, would offer some explanation or some defence to this accusation. But they're strangely silent on it. I'm not sure what their reasoning is, but it comes off as a "we don't want to talk about this because it undermines our argument" type of thing. However, a defence can absolutely be made. If the Germans hadn't gotten themselves into the situation they're in the first place, they wouldn't have been able to blame the Italians when they failed to show up. So maybe GAMBARA is at fault in that moment in time, but the Germans are still at fault overall. Rommel and Crüwell had messed up previously, not the Italians, so they should take the blame. It's not an airtight defence, but at least it's something. Anyway, in the afternoon, the German Panzer divisions tried to advance on Bir el Gubi again, but the blob of intermixed German units stalled the attack before it even began. 15th Panzer Division went on alone towards the end of the day and clashed with the 22nd Guards Brigade. They lost several tanks under a heavy air bombardment and against stiff opposition. Then Neumann-Silkow was hit by an artillery shell blast. Wounded, the Germans rushed him to the hospital at Derna, and 15th Panzer Division no longer had a commander. Despite his sacrifice and the sacrifice of his men, the attack was a failure. Clearly, Rommel's forces are exhausted, while British forces were being reinforced. But British forces were also exhausted and the stalemate was on. However, because of the supply situation, a stalemate favours the British. The situation was now desperate for the Germans. Rommel now has a decision to make. Should he retreat or should he continue the fight? And could he even mount an attack anyway? Or a retreat? The fuel situation is terrible, his men are fatigued, and most of the Italian forces would have to move on foot. Perhaps he could do neither. Perhaps, no matter what he chooses, the men trapped on the frontier were going to be in trouble. There's only one way to find out what he'll do, and that's by watching next week's episode. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.